Tennessee, America's 16th state, is bordered on the east by the majestic Appalachian Mountains and on the west by the mighty Mississippi River. What lies between is a spectacular range of images, nearly 20,000 miles of rivers and streams, stunning geological formations, quiet fields where some of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War were fought. It's home to one of America's most controversial public works programs and the most visited national park in the United States. What other state can claim ownership of the grandest icon of country music, the birthplace of the blues, and the homes of the Queen of Soul and the King of Rock and Roll? An aerial trip through Tennessee is a magical, musical ride over timeless wonders. Long before Elvis got here, Tennessee was home to the Cherokee Indians. In 1540, Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto was the first European to travel to what would eventually become Tennessee on a quest to find silver and gold. He crossed the Mississippi near this point. De Soto never did find silver or gold, and in 1542, he died on the banks of the Mississippi River. More than 100 years later, the French and British also arrived to stake their claims here. Fort Loudon, the first planned fort on the western frontier, was built by the British in 1756 to keep the French army out of the Appalachian region and to maintain the alliance the Brits had formed with the Cherokee tribe. But that alliance turned to disaster. Over time, betrayal and mistrust left the Cherokee weary, and they surrounded the fort until the British families living there ran out of food and water. The present-day fort is a replica of the original and surrounded by a man-made lake. It is recognized as a National Historic Landmark. Just south of Fort Loudon sits the birthplace of a mixed-blood Cherokee Indian named Sequoyah, now marked by a stylish museum complex. Fascinated by the European immigrants' ability to communicate with marks on paper, or what he called talking leaves, Sequoyah was convinced that a written form of language would help his people. He spent 12 years working on a system of writing for the Cherokee language. It quickly became the official written language of the Cherokee. Newspapers and books were printed, and in just a few years, the literacy rate of the Cherokee was said to be 95%. Today, this land is owned by the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians, and a museum to promote understanding of the Cherokee culture was built. Modern Tennessee has three distinct regions, officially known as three grand divisions. West Tennessee is made up of lush farmlands, cities, and small towns built on the banks of the Mississippi River and reaching to the Tennessee River. Its history and culture are distinct from the rest of the state. This region has had a significant influence on American music. Middle Tennessee is home to the state's capital, Nashville. While Memphis may have brought America the blues and rock and roll, Nashville is the world capital for country music. But our journey begins in eastern Tennessee, a region filled with dense forests and breathtaking mountains. These roads were originally just a mountain trail. But even 2 centuries ago, it was the early American version of a superhighway. Called the Cumberland Gap, it was one of the most important routes for early settlers, Native Americans, and possibly even bison. The Gap is a low point in the Cumberland region of the Appalachian Mountains, where the states of Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee all meet. Steep cliffs that rise hundreds of feet off the valley floor line its sides. Scientists believe the path was created by stream erosion that took place over millions of years. American colonists, barricaded by the mountains, were anxious for a way to expand west. So pioneer Daniel Boone led a team of 30 men to mark and cut a trail, giving access to settlers who used it to journey to the western frontiers of Kentucky and Tennessee. This part of the Gap was called the Wilderness Trail. Hundreds of thousands of people either walked, rode, or were carried across the Cumberland Gap, part of which is now a national park. Further south in the Appalachians sits the most visited national park in the United States, the Great Smoky Mountains. This national park covers more than 500,000 acres. Geologists believe these mountains are millions of years old, much older than the Rocky Mountains. The Cherokee Indians living here called the land the Place of Blue Smoke because of the smoky blue haze that sits over the mountains. In the early 1900s, lumber companies moved in and began logging here. Within 20 years, despite the protests of conservationists, 2/3 of the trees had been cut down. In 1934, Congress established the Great Smoky Mountains as a national park. It's home to countless animal species, including at least 700 black bears. The park has more species of plants than any other area on the continent. It's an international biosphere reserve and a World Heritage Site. Bordering the Great Smoky Mountains National Park is a beautiful but often overlooked treasure. The 640,000-acre Cherokee National Forest follows the ancient ridges of the southern Appalachian Mountains, their valleys filled with a chain of lakes. It's the largest public tract of land in Tennessee. Resting at the foothills and surrounded on 3 sides by the Smokies is Gatlinburg, a destination for vacationing tourists. The Skylift takes riders on a 500-foot ascent over Gatlinburg to the top of Crockett Mountain. And the aerial tramway is one of the largest in the country. The 2 120-passenger counterbalanced cars lift off to take passengers to Gatlinburg's wintertime ski runs. In the 1900s, Pigeon Forge was a small mountain village with no paved roads. Today, it's known mostly for a giant theme park called Dollywood, co-owned by Tennessee native and country music superstar Dolly Parton. A vintage steam train runs through this 125-acre park, which combines crafts native to this region with thrill rides and water parks. It was named Dollywood to draw Dolly Parton fans who might be coming to Tennessee for another attraction. Knoxville was the site of the 1982 World's Fair. Some were cynical about the choice of Knoxville as the site for the fair. A Wall Street Journal writer called Knoxville a scruffy little city. Maybe that was just the impetus the city needed. The fair was the last successful World's Fair held in America, with 22 countries and more than 50 corporations participating. 11 million visitors came for the experience, and the fair made a profit of exactly $57. Today, the most striking reminder of the fair is the Sun Sphere, a 266-foot tower with a 75-foot-high giant globe on top. The window panels are layered in 24-karat gold dust, and an observation deck offers visitors views of the city. Knoxville is Tennessee's third largest city and was the state's first capital from 1796 through 1819. The city sits on the Tennessee River and is home to the University of Tennessee, the Volunteers. Chartered in 1794, today UT has nearly 30,000 students. But basketball is what the Vols are most famous for. Women's basketball. Given the success and large following of women's basketball here, it seemed the only logical place to have the National Women's Basketball Hall of Fame. Built in 1999, the Hall of Fame honors both men and women who have contributed to the sport of women's basketball. The ball that sits on the roof is 30 feet high, weighs 10 tons, and sits on top of a glass staircase that was created to resemble a basketball net. A few miles northwest of Knoxville is a town that was born in secrecy. Oak Ridge, Tennessee is 10 miles long and 2 miles wide. The whole thing surrounded by a high chain-linked fence, topped with barbed wire and patrolled by guards on horseback. This area used to be filled with small farming towns until 1942. America was at war, and suddenly the farmers here began getting visits from federal officials. They only wanted one thing: all of the land. Reluctantly, and with little choice, 1,000 families left their small farming communities, and soon thousands of engineers, scientists, and construction workers swarmed into the new land. Construction began, and 3 huge windowless buildings were erected within months. Oak Ridge had a secret. Of the 75,000 people who lived and worked here, only 1% knew what was really going on. Workers were told, "Loose lips sink ships." Meanwhile, some of the most brilliant scientific minds in the United States were working to produce the most powerful bomb the world had ever known. Oak Ridge was part of the Manhattan Project, the American government's highly secret initiative to develop an atomic bomb. And on August 6, 1945, when America dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, it ultimately brought World War II to an end. Even today, aircraft must keep their distance from the site, and the buildings are still used by the United States Department of Energy for federal projects. Oak Ridge isn't the only secret in the Tennessee hills. This is the home of the oldest registered distillery in the United States and its renowned whiskey, named after Jasper Newton Daniel, better known as Jack Daniel. When he was just a teenager, Jack Daniel bought his whiskey distillery from a local Lutheran minister. He handcrafted the sour mash whiskey from his secret ingredient, the spring water piped into the distillery from a nearby limestone cave. Ironically, Lynchburg, Tennessee is a dry town, so while the whiskey can be distilled here, it can't be purchased. Following an infection from a broken toe, Daniel died from blood poisoning in 1911 and is buried near the distillery, now a National Historic Landmark. Tennessee is home to 28 sites recognized by the National Park Service as historic landmarks. One of them, located 131 miles from Lynchburg in the small town of Dayton, was home to a publicity stunt that turned into one of the most famous trials in American history. In this courthouse in 1925, Tennessee passed the Butler Act, a law that made it illegal to teach any theory that denied the biblical story of creation, specifically Darwin's theory of evolution. In July of 1925, John Scopes was arrested for teaching Darwinism. News of the impending trial traveled quickly, and this man, William Jennings Bryan, known for his crusade against Darwinism, offered his services as a prosecutor for free. That's when Clarence Darrow, an agnostic, offered to defend Mr. Scopes, also for free. It was called the Monkey Trial because of its association with evolution. Scopes was found guilty and fined $100. However, a year later, the verdict was overturned on appeal. The Ray County Courthouse is still in use, and its most famous trial raised issues debated in America to this very day. Chattanooga, the fourth largest city in Tennessee, is located on a 7-mile bend in the Tennessee River near the border of Georgia. The town's fame rests on a song about a train, the invention of moon pies, and a poetically named Civil War battle. Lookout Mountain rises up over the city of Chattanooga. Sitting atop the mountain is a one-of-a-kind piece of Americana. Part nature, part fantasy, Rock City features caves and ancient rock formations carved by nature over millions of years. Rock City's history as a tourist attraction dates back to before the Great Depression, when a local businessman wanted to turn the area into a residential community called Fairyland. Here it is said that on a clear day, one can see 7 states. About 100 years earlier, Lookout Mountain had grabbed the attention of another man with dreams. In 1852, Colonel James Whiteside built a road to his property on the top of the mountain. He called it Point Lookout. During the Civil War, Point Lookout became an observation post. The Confederate Army held the mountain, but in 1863, Union forces led by General Ulysses S. Grant won a decisive victory and took over the mountain in what was called the Battle Above the Clouds. Today, visitors can ride up one of the steepest passenger railways in the world. At the top of the incline sits Point Park, part of the Chickamauga-Chattanooga National Military Park. The New York Peace Memorial, featuring a Union and Confederate soldier shaking hands, is just one of the monuments to the men who fought and died here. When the Civil War ended, Chattanooga continued to be a major railroad hub and industrial center. It was known as the Dynamo of Dixie and inspired Glenn Miller's big band swing song, Chattanooga Choo Choo. But the mountains that made Chattanooga such a scenic town also trapped in the pollution being created here. In 1969, Walter Cronkite announced on the CBS Evening News that the Environmental Protection Agency deemed Chattanooga the dirtiest city in America. Embarrassed and humiliated, city leaders mounted an $850 million cleanup. Today, the city is vibrant and the air is clean. Today's highways heading west bear no sign of an earlier, more painful journey. It became known as the Trail of Tears. From May 1838 through March 1839, the federal government removed 16,000 Cherokee Indians from Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, and North Carolina. Many walked barefoot the entire way from East Tennessee to Oklahoma. It's believed that more than 4,000 Native Americans died on the journey. The development of Raccoon Mountain is the result of another federal plan. The Tennessee Valley Authority was created in 1933 and signed into law by President Franklin Roosevelt. Its mission was to provide flood control and cheap electric power, and to improve economic development in the Tennessee Valley, an area hit hard by the Great Depression. Today, the TVA is the largest public power company in the United States and provides electricity for most of Tennessee and parts of Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Virginia, an area with a population of more than 8 million people. In the 1960s, the TVA was looking for ways to meet the growing demand for more power to run new appliances in people's homes. The idea was to create a reservoir on top of Raccoon Mountain and then funnel the water to a turbine 1,000 feet under the mountain. It was called a waste of taxpayers' money, wild-eyed, and impractical. Despite the scandal, the TVA began work. Over 8 years, a man-made lake holding 60 million cubic yards of water was created on top of the mountain and sealed by an 8,500-foot-long dam. Deep below the lake sits a turbine pump house that releases water from the dam when needed and then pumps it back up to the top at a rate of 7 million gallons per minute. Today, it's considered a modern marvel of engineering. The giant factory feel of this area is in stark contrast to the rolling hills of Middle Tennessee's plantation country. This nearly 6,000-acre plantation was won in a game of chance. Rattle and Snap Plantation is an example of the lavish scale of many Southern homes built before the Civil War. William Polk built the Rattle and Snap Plantation for his son George. Polk, one of the largest landholders in Tennessee at the time, won the nearly 6,000-acre tract in a game of chance that's played with beans. The game was called Rattle and Snap. Built in 1853, Belle Meade is often called the Queen of Tennessee plantations. Originally spanning more than 5,000 acres, nearly 150 people lived here, mostly slaves. Today, the property covers 30 acres and includes the original mansion and several of the original outbuildings. It's owned by the Association for the Preservation of Tennessee Antiquities. Outside of Nashville sits the Carnton Plantation. Built in 1826, the home was the location of large social gatherings and visits from presidents and business leaders. But that all changed at 4 o'clock in the afternoon of November 30th, 1864, when Carnton came under attack by Union troops. In only 5 hours of fighting, more than 9,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or unaccounted for, most of them Confederate soldiers. The Confederacy also lost 12 generals as casualties that day. Soon, the elegantly manicured lawns at Carnton were filled with the injured and dying. It is said that the floors of the home are still stained with the blood of soldiers, and many of their ghosts are rumored to be here as well. Carnton was not the only place in Tennessee bloodied by Civil War battles. Tennessee was the last state in the South to join the Confederacy. But when President Lincoln called for rebel states to be subdued, some Tennesseans took up arms with their fellow Southerners in the Confederacy. The eastern part of the state remained loyal to the Union throughout the war. More Civil War battles were fought here than in any other state except Virginia. One was the Battle of Stones River. 80,000 Confederate and Union soldiers fought for 3 days. There were over 23,000 casualties. And although the Union claimed a victory and took control of Middle Tennessee, it came with a heavy price. They lost more than 13,000 of their soldiers in what was one of the bloodiest battles fought on the Western Front. Today, the battlefield is a national park. Among its 700 acres is the Stones River National Cemetery. Established in 1865 and filled with more than 6,000 Union graves and more than 2,000 unknowns. More than 4,000 acres rest in private hands and have been consumed by new development and urban sprawl. Local conservation groups are working to try and preserve this land that is in danger of being paved over. When the last cannons fired at the Battle of Shiloh, located a little more than 30 miles away from Stones River, nearly another 24,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. More than all the casualties of the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Mexican-American War combined. Ironically, Shiloh is a Hebrew word meaning place of peace. General Grant's men bore the brunt of the fighting over 2 days, when the Confederate Army launched a surprise attack while the Union soldiers ate breakfast. Critics condemned Grant's poor performance and suggested that he was drunk leading up to the attack. The next day, he commanded his troops to regain their lost territory And that's what they did. Ultimately, the South was defeated again. After the battle, the Union troops gathered as many of the dead bodies as they could and buried them with simple wooden crosses. In 1889, the Shiloh National Cemetery was created here. There are 3,584 Civil War dead, 2,359 of them unknown. Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, arrived in Nashville when Tennessee was still the frontier. He bought 425 acres of land where he would eventually create his stately southern plantation home, the Hermitage. Jackson was not an aristocrat like the presidents who preceded him. He was a scrappy, short-tempered man. At the Hermitage, he grew cotton and advanced his political career. Jackson led the American forces to defeat the British at the Battle of New Orleans in 1812. His role in that battle helped Jackson win the presidency in 1828. He served 2 terms. Probably the most controversial aspect of his presidency, by modern standards, was his plan to remove Native Americans from their land, ultimately causing the Trail of Tears. Today, the Hermitage is a popular tourist destination and one of the oldest historic site museums in the country, situated as it is just outside Nashville, Tennessee's state capital. Some people call it Twang Town. Locals call it Nash Vegas. And while it is the state capital of Tennessee, it's best known as Music City. And most of the world's top country singers call it home. Nashville has seen a transformation from a frontier settlement to a thriving city, with a football franchise, a hockey team, and the slicker, glossier world of today's country musicians. The Country Music Hall of Fame in Nashville is filled with mementos from some of country music's most storied veterans: Patsy Cline, Elvis Presley, and Johnny Cash, and one of its first inductees, Hank Williams Sr. The building is 130,000 square feet. Depending on what angle it's viewed from, it resembles a piano, the fin tail of a Cadillac, a bass clef, or a radio tower. The museum is filled with artifacts that trace the history of country music. Nashville's rise as the capital of country music came because of the popularity of a radio station. WSM began broadcasting in 1925. A live radio show produced here would change the country music industry forever. It's the Grand Ole Opry. The first broadcast took place in October of 1925 and played at this building, the Ryman Auditorium, from 1943 to 1974. The Grand Ole Opry is the longest continuous running live radio show in U.S. history. In 1954, a teenager named Elvis Presley walked through these doors and performed here. When he was done, one of the show's organizers told him he should stick to his day job as a trucker in Memphis. Elvis never performed at the Opry again. Nevertheless, today the Opry is an institution. It's not just a Tennessee icon, but also a potent symbol of American culture. Of course, Nashville's history began long before high-rise buildings or when the first country singer came to town. Nashville became the permanent capital of Tennessee in 1843. 2 years later, work began on a state capitol building. The architect, William Strickland, died while the Capitol was being built, and according to his wishes, was buried in the walls of the building. Completed in 1859, the Capitol sits on a hill overlooking the city. Many of Tennessee's most prominent citizens are honored here. President James Polk and his wife are both buried here. The Greek Revival Building is one of the oldest working state capitals in the country. At the time, Nashville was dubbed the Athens of the South. So, the citizens built themselves an exact replica of the Greek Parthenon for the state's centennial celebration in 1897. So many of America's characters have come from these rolling hills. The famous frontiersman Davy Crockett and Sam Houston. But many would argue that you'd have to head west to find Tennessee's most vivid characters. Separated from the rest of the state by the Tennessee River, West Tennessee has its own culture and folklore. Highway 61, also known as the Blues Trail, cuts north through the Mississippi Delta, the birthplace of the blues, and leads to Memphis, the breeding ground of some of America's greatest musical gifts to the world. Sitting right on the Mississippi River, in its early days, Memphis was a busy port city and a center for the southern slave trade. The soil and climate of much of West Tennessee were perfect for growing cotton, and as a result, much of the land here was dominated by large plantations. Cotton was king. But having so much cotton was only good if it could be sold. In 1873, the Memphis Cotton Exchange was created. Cotton farmers would come to this building downtown and sell their harvest to traders, who would then sell it to textile manufacturers. The cotton was shipped out of Memphis on steamboats, and in later years, on trains. The cotton fields were worked by slaves. During their arduous days in the field, they would sing and clap, do field hollers and work songs. Their methods for creating music would have a lasting impact on every form of American music, beginning with the blues. African-American musician and bandleader W.C. Handy began to experiment with the unusual rhythms and cadence of the former slaves' music. At his headquarters on Beale Street, Handy wrote a wildly popular song called The Memphis Blues. Handy brought the music to a much wider audience, and today is known as the father of the blues. And here on Beale Street, it was Blues Central. By the 1920s, the sounds of the blues rang out on the streets of Memphis, especially here on Beale Street. In these clubs and restaurants was played some of the hottest music in the country. Over the next 20 years, Louis Armstrong, Muddy Waters, and many other blues legends performed on Beale Street. In the 70s, Beale Street was officially declared the home of the blues by an act of the United States Congress. It's one of the most storied addresses in popular music. And not too far away, there's another one. On July 5th, 1954, Sam Phillips was sitting in his office here at Sun Records when a 19-year-old walked in the door and sang, "That's All Right." That young man was Elvis Presley, and the song became an overnight sensation. During the hourly tours given here, visitors can touch the microphone and stand on the exact spot where Elvis stood to record his first song. For those who need a bigger fix of Elvis, there's plenty to be seen just a short way south on old US Highway 51. When he was just 22 years old, Elvis bought Graceland, a 14-acre estate. He died here 20 years later. In 1982, Graceland opened to the public as a museum. Tourists can even visit one of his private jets. Nearly 650,000 visitors make the pilgrimage to Graceland each year. Elvis's name is synonymous with Memphis, and the city often gets credited as the home of the blues and the place where rock and roll was born. But its contributions to soul music are often overlooked. Memphis Soul got some attention in 2000 when the Smithsonian Institution opened its 8,000 square foot Memphis Rock and Soul Museum just off Beale Street. The Smithsonian's first permanent exhibition outside of Washington, D.C. and New York. Memphis Soul was further honored in 2003 when the Stax Museum of American Soul was opened here. In the 1960s, Stax Records was the second best soul record label in the country after Motown. Memphis Soul was grittier and born out of the blues. Al Green, Isaac Hayes, and Otis Redding are only a few of the artists who recorded at Stax. Black and white musicians worked alongside each other at Stax, a rarity in a largely segregated city. But that racial harmony came to an end in 1968, largely because of an event that took place not too far from Stax recording studios. This building is part of the National Civil Rights Museum, founded to commemorate the events of the 4th of April, 1968. On that date, at 6:01 p.m., Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed here in Memphis at the nearby Lorraine Motel. This building was originally the rooming house across from the motel where James Earl Ray allegedly fired the fatal shot. The museum chronicles the struggle for racial equality from the days of slavery up through Dr. King's death. Today, Memphis is still known and visited for the musical revolutions that began here. It's also a 5-time winner of the nation's Cleanest City Award. In 1991, planners wanted to create a visual landmark here. They decided to build the Great American Pyramid. At 321 feet tall, it's the 6th largest pyramid in the world. Once used as a sports arena and concert venue, today it stands empty. The nearby FedEx Forum took over as the main venue in town. FedEx Forum is only one small part of the Federal Express presence here in Memphis. The company's headquarters are here too. FedEx is the largest employer in Memphis, with more than 30,000 employees and a super hub at the airport. Sometimes even vintage World War II planes, like this Hawker Sea Fury, fly over Memphis, a city that will always be known for the rich musical traditions born here. From its ancient eastern mountains to its rolling central hills and very musical West End, Tennessee tells the story of America's expansion west and all of the celebration and sadness that came with it. From the air, Tennessee is a natural beauty, rugged, inviting, and infused with the spirit of a nation.